welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and start our talk for today. So today we're lucky enough to have Ryan Isakson join us, and he will be giving the third talk in our series on building resilience in food and health supply chains. And so we were brought to this topic originally through Chris, who was, for those of you who haven't been to the other talks, helped combine or compile a sort of a group of academics loosely affiliated to the various aspects and dimensions of supply chains relevant to both food systems and health systems. And so each of the early speakers are really focused on some of the particular components of those supply systems, though maybe not the entire supply chain itself. So with that, I'm looking forward to hearing a bit about Ryan Isakson's research. So Ryan is a associate professor of geography and planning, and also let me pull up my introduction here, sorry. And also professor of international development studies at University of Toronto Scarborough. And he joined U of T in 2011 after a short stint at St. Mary's University in Halifax in Nova Scotia. So Ryan's research is largely focused on the political economy of food systems and agrarian change, particularly in Latin American context, but his research really falls into three overlapping themes. So first, the political ecology of peasant livelihoods and agricultural biodiversity in the Guatemalan Highlands. Second, the links between financialization and food system change. And third, the politics of land control and flex crops. And so today, we are lucky enough to hear a bit about his work on, where's the title? I just lost it. Resilient for Whom? The Commercialization of Agriculture and Food Security in Guatemala. So with that, I will turn it over to Ryan, and I look forward to hearing your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. And thanks to all of you for your patience with me today. Thank you for your presence and being here. And it's a real pleasure to be here, to have this opportunity to share some of my work with you. I'm going to try and share some slides here. And excuse me, I don't normally use Zoom. I use Blackboard Collaborate. Okay. And all right, able to see that okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. So I'll just do it this way. So again, thanks for your patience with me. Michael had mentioned, I've done a lot of my research in the Latin American context, and I've done so, I'm as an economist, or more specifically a political economist. And so I've done a lot of my research, from the perspective of agrarian political economy, and within the dimensions that some might call political ecology. And much of this research has been carried out over the past 19 years now in the Guatemalan context. So I'm going to share various bits of that research with you today, focusing primarily upon some research I did, well, combining two projects essentially. One project from 2011, looking at the development of non-traditional agricultural exports in Guatemala. Was combining that with a more recent project that I started just last year in 2019, looking at the ways in which financial inclusion is transforming agriculture in various departments of the country. And that the focus of that is, well, a couple of surveys. One survey to 500 peasant farmers in 3 different departments of the country, another survey of 400 within the Department of Ecology, as well as interviews that I started in January, which were unfortunately cut short due to the pandemic. So I'll be sharing some preliminary findings from that research as well. Now, starting off, what I would like to focus on for this research then is a comparison of 2 of the more dominant forms of what many would call peasant agriculture in Guatemala. And I use the term peasant intentionally. Peasant, of course, refers to small-scale agrarian agricultural producers, but much of my work is with indigenous producers within Guatemala who, like peasants elsewhere in the world, have suffered a long history of marginalization, political marginalization, economic marginalization, cultural marginalization. Indeed, they were often targeted during the country's 36-year civil war, which officially ended in 1996. So these two forms of agriculture I would like to compare and contrast. One is what is colloquially referred to as Milpa in Spanish, which is a traditional maize-based agricultural system. And then to compare that to a more novel form of peasant agriculture, which I refer to as non-traditional agricultural exports, or NTAE, excuse me, for short. And you'll see on the slide here, we've got some cultivation of snow peas, as well as blackberries, two of the more prominent non-traditional agricultural exports in the area of the country I'll be discussing with you today. So we'll be doing that as a comparison. And what I'm trying to show here in these two slides here is, on the one hand, on the right hand, what you're seeing here is a dramatic increase in the amount of land dedicated to the cultivation of those non-traditional agricultural exports, beginning in the mid-1990s. And that coincided with a significant drop in the amount of land cultivated with maize agriculture around that same time. Now, you will note it subsequently picked up, but in some sense it was a transitioning and reflective of changing land use practices, where during this latter part of the 1990s into the current day, you're seeing a transition away from maize and its heartland and into more colonization in the deforested areas of the Petén northern part of the country. And so again, I'll get to some of the nuances of why we've seen this replacement of non-traditional of maize agriculture or milpa agriculture with non-traditional agriculture in today's presentation. And in particular, I'd like to focus upon three questions. One is the question of why are peasant farmers in Guatemala transitioning away from milpa and into the non-traditional agricultural exports? Two is, what are the ramifications for this transition for food security, both in the country, the peasant agricultural producers, as well as the global food supply? And then thirdly, what are the ramifications of this for resilient food systems? So these are the questions. And as I get into these questions, it's helpful to notice where I'm coming from. As I mentioned, I've trained as a political economist, and I've been diving into the realm of political ecology since I've been placed in a geography department at University of Toronto. And within political ecology, there's literature which is oftentimes critical of the term resilience. In particular, you have scholars like Michael Watts, Michael Taylor, Roman Feli, and others arguing that on the one hand, resilience is oftentimes interpreted in a fairly conservative manner. On the one hand, oftentimes it's this idea of how do we achieve resilience? It's by adapting to change. And what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve the reproduction of the status quo. So it's a fairly, many political ecologists would argue that resilience is somewhat conservative to the extent that it's simply trying to maintain the status quo as to push for deeper and more transformative changes and developments. Other scholars have also pointed out, and this also comes from Roman Feli, that within political ecology, if we're doing this for a governmentality perspective, we sometimes need to question who is targeted for adaptation and the of why they should adapt in terms of what put them in the position where they had to adapt. And then thirdly, what are they adapting to? These are some of the more critical takes on resilience. I do think there's certainly some notes of caution that we should think of within our broader project here. But additionally, I think that, resilience have to be interpreted in these ways, and resilience can in fact be more transformative. Sometimes some of those more pragmatic approaches are indeed more amenable to pragmatic solutions. A second contextual point that I want to bring into this is that Guatemala is arguably one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change in Latin America. As you can see in this figure here, this is an image of what's called in English, the dry corridor, the Central American dry corridor. And what that reflects on that image there is those are all areas where you have areas of Central America that have dry periods or dry seasons that last at least 4 months. Oftentimes in many parts of this dry corridor, particularly in parts of Honduras, El Salvador, and southeastern Guatemala, those dry periods are much longer. And they are indeed extending in the current era. And of course, agricultural producers within this region of the world are highly vulnerable to various types of environmental stresses, especially drought in the contemporary context. And in the Guatemalan context, particularly in the Northwestern Highlands, where I've done much of my research, there's even during the rainy season, there's oftentimes a mid-rainy season drought known as the canicula. And that basically refers to, it's like I said, it's a mid-season, usually typically about 3 weeks, that would arrive in June. However, in recent years, it's been arriving earlier, in July, it's been arriving in June, and much longer. Last year's canicula lasted for, I think, close to 2 months. Which resulted in widespread crop failure. And indeed, you've seen widespread crop failure throughout the country for the last 4 years, due to the erratic and expanded nature of this mid-rainy season drought. So those are the 2 contextual points that I want to bring in before talking about this comparison of Milpa agriculture with the non-traditional agriculture. Now, when I talk about Milpa, part of my key argument that I've made, not just in my presentation today, but throughout much of my writing, is that this Milpa agriculture, this traditional maize-based agriculture, is on the one hand, it's a cornerstone of food security for Guatemalan peasant farmers, that's to say the farmers who are producing the maize. But secondly, that this Milpa actually makes important contributions to the resiliency of the global food system. That's to say, it underpins the global food supply by providing much of the agricultural biodiversity that allows that food system to adapt to various environmental change over time. And in part, if I were to focus upon that, basically what I'm getting at here is the argument of agricultural biodiversity or crop genetic resources, wherein, for instance, if we look at the research from the eminent Russian Nikolai Vavilov and his research in the 1920s, he traveled throughout the world identifying hotspots for agricultural biodiversity. And what you can hear is a map from his 1926 publication in which he identified regions of agricultural biodiversity. And of course, part of this is the Mesoamerican region of southern Mexico and northwestern Guatemala, the highlands of northwest Guatemala, which Vavilov and others have referred to as a mega center of agricultural biodiversity. And part of this diversity just simply is rooted in the fact that these are centers in which agriculture originally started some 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, in which you had native people, or you had the populations domesticating wild and weedy endemic species of weeds into crops, and over time cultivating various varieties of those crops. So in the Mesoamerican megacenter of biodiversity that I'm referring to, farmers not only domesticated maize, one of the world's most prominently consumed crops, but other important crops like chiles, tomatoes, vanilla, sisal. Gosh, the list goes on, and my mind is blanking at the moment, but there is indeed a long list. And much within the Guatemalan context, if we're focusing upon maize, as I pointed out, much of this diversity is concentrated in the Northwestern Highlands, in particular the departments of Sololá, Totonicapán, Chimaltenango. Now, I should point out, what you're seeing here is this is based upon a diversity index that I developed based upon data collected by E.J. Wellhausen and his colleagues way back in 1957. And that was the last time anybody did a systemic cataloging of maize diversity, not only in Guatemala, but Mexico and Latin America. And during that, and so Wellhausen and his team, they were hired by the Rockefeller Foundation to identify various crop genetic resources. And in the 1957 publication, which they focused upon Guatemala, they singled it out as arguably the country with the rich diversity of maize in the world. while in countries like Mexico have more diversity, given its relatively smaller size, Guatemala is indeed has a much richer concentration, according to Wellhausen and colleagues. So what is Milpa, right? As basically when we talked about, when you see Milpa, when you ask a Guatemalan farmer what is Milpa, this is oftentimes what they'll point you to. Most of us would look at this and say, well, it's a cornfield. And indeed, Milpa is a cornfield, but it is also much, much more. If you get into the milpas and you look at them, oftentimes you'll see a lot more going on. For instance, in addition to growing maize, the maize stalks act as a trellis for various legumes, mostly beans, to grow up. The beans in turn will fix nitrogen in the soil that allow that corn to grow. You'll see various types of squash on the ground, and the squash with their broad leaves will help to keep weeds down as well as to retain moisture in the soil. Sometimes you'll see fruit trees, and even weeds known as quelites that are oftentimes used for medicinal herbs and seasonings and so on. So what you're seeing within these milpas is incredibly rich infra-crop diversity, that's to say a diversity of a lot of species of crops, but also the centerpiece of the milpa is the maize, and even within those milpa plots, you'll see a tremendous diversity of different types of maize. So where I did much of my PhD research in the highlands of Totonicapán, the average household, as you see here, typically cultivated 3 different varieties of maize. And when Wellhausen and colleagues did their survey of Guatemalan maize diversity in the 1950s, they identified 23 distinct varieties of maize cultivated in the country, and various variants of those. So you see tremendous amount of diversity maintained within these milpas, both intra-crop diversity as well as infra-crop diversity. Now, much of this milpa is, of course, cultivated by small-scale peasant farmers, excuse me, and the output is largely dedicated towards direct household consumption. If there's any surplus, it might be sold in local markets, potentially to neighbors and so on. The contributions into this milpa to food security are 5-fold. On the one hand, the milpa basically acts as habitat and the ongoing evolution of maize genetic diversity, maize of course being one of humankind's principal food crops, and again Guatemala being a center of maize diversity and providing much of the genetic diversity that allows plant breeders and so on to access genetic resources which they then can draft into more improved and high yielding seed variety. Secondly, maize is a principal source of food for the rural poor. It provides 72% of their calories, 82% of their protein. Thirdly, maize can be the foundation for a nutritious diet for the rural poor. Much of that is particularly among the indigenous population, in order to prepare it for human consumption and make the tamales and tortillas and the various products made from those, treated through a process of nixtamalization. And that basically entails soaking the lime grain in a mixture of water and limestone. And on the one hand, that provides the grain with calcium, but it also makes the niacin and amino acids that are sometimes indigestible otherwise, makes them digestible when consuming the maize. But secondly, within the milpa, as I pointed out, milpa isn't just maize. It's oftentimes cultivated with other crops like beans, which would provide complementary amino acids to create complete proteins, tomatoes, and other vegetables which provide vitamin C, vitamin E, fruity acids, avocados which provide fats. And for these reasons, the biologist Garrison Wilkes referred to the milpa as one of humankind's greatest inventions. On the one hand, not only because of those ecological complements that one sees in the inter-crop milpa, but also those dietary complements in creating a nutrient complete package. So in addition to that, the milpa is a relatively guaranteed food or secure source of food. Indeed, these are the milpa crops are made, the milpa consists of crops basically of domesticated weeds, which are quite resilient to various localized environmental stresses, making it reliable, but also that diversity means that should pests or weather destroy one crop or one particular variety of maize, there's always other crops and other varieties of maize that can act as a backstop. Thirdly or fifthly, that if we consider if we take the UN Food and Agricultural Organization's definition of food security to heart, we also have to consider culturally meaningful forms of food provisioning. And indeed, maize is a highly important or culturally significant crop for much of the Mayan indigenous population, which dominates the Guatemalan Highlands. And I won't go into the stories there, but there's a number of fascinating stories about the role of maize and the Mayan creation stories and so on. So the Milpa makes important contributions to, on the one hand, global food security by cultivating and maintaining and indeed creating a constantly evolving source of maize genetic resources, but also contributing to the food security of Guatemalan peasant farmers. Despite the importance of Milpa to food security, both in Guatemala and on a global scale, it was de-developed, I argue, during the country's civil war, during the height of the violence during the Civil War, which also happened to be the height of the so-called Green Revolution, when you had organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the U.S. Agency for International Development, promoting the adoption of high-yielding seed varieties, essentially oftentimes commercial seed varieties, and the nitrogen fertilizer to which those seed varieties were highly responsive. Now, during the Civil War, the Guatemalan government oftentimes promoted high-yielding seed varieties as a counterinsurgency tactic, much like the logic of the Green Revolution in other countries. The logic was, if you had peasant farmers who were protesting or upset because of their conditions of poverty and lack of land, that maybe they wouldn't need more land, maybe they wouldn't be so poor if they just simply got more output per acre of land, had higher yields. And so this Green Revolution technology was promoted throughout Guatemala. And as other scholars like, in particular, Nicholas Copeland has argued, oftentimes farmers adopted this Green Revolution package because they wanted to be considered modern or Western. And indeed, after a long history of being enslaved and again, economically, politically marginalized, targeted by the government during the Civil War as being insurgents, civil war that many deemed a genocide. Many of them deemed that, many indigenous farmers felt that if they adopted this Green Revolution seeds, they would be integrated into the mainstream. But also there were threats of violence, where farmers who failed to adopt these revolution technologies were oftentimes thought to be insurgents and against the state, and so were targeted for violence. And so you had scholars like, name is escaping me, I think David Carey and Eric Holt Jimenez, providing much of that story about the ways in which peasant farmers who did not adopt those Green Revolution technologies being targeted by state-sponsored violence during that Civil War. And so at the end of the Civil War, then you had a significant but by no means complete transformation of Milpa agriculture to Green Revolution agriculture. And what that meant was oftentimes, instead of farmers saving their seeds, they became dependent upon purchase seeds or distributed seeds from the government, high-yielding seed varieties, but also, again, those applications of chemical fertilizers. And chemical fertilizers sometimes discouraged intercropping. Many farmers talk about how the application of chemical fertilizers makes the land too hot for beans. And so it discourages intercropping with beans and that important source of proteins within the Milpa diet. And so as a consequence of this widespread, but by no means complete adoption of high-yielding seed varieties, you saw the loss of those more traditional landrace seed varieties, a growing dependence upon those hybrid seed varieties, increased use of agrochemicals, and ultimately less diverse agricultural systems. Again, as the Milpa or the high-yielding seed varieties were less conducive to that intercropping. So, and I should point out that much of this, in order to promote the Green Revolution seed variety. It was oftentimes promoted through the state provided technical assistance, they provided free seeds, they provided free and subsidized fertilizer. The state rural development bank provided subsidized credit for fertilizer seed purchases. And there were indeed various trade protections in place as well in terms of protective tariffs, as well as high quotas on imported maize. But much of that subsequently dismantled during the 1990s, when under structural adjustment loans, the contingencies attached to those loans oftentimes called for the rolling back of those various protections, and the government cut public extension services, agricultural outreach. It was forced to liberalize trade markets, particularly for certain products, but not others. It was forced to privatize its grain storage infrastructure, but also the Rural Development Bank was privatized, became a for-profit bank. And also there was the facilitation of an inflow of financial capital, which facilitated an influx of various foreign banks, but also microfinance institutions, which become a little bit more important in the latter part of today's story. And as a result, what you see here is a country which was fairly self-sufficient in terms of its maize production throughout, prior to the Green Revolution, through the Green Revolution up until the 1990s, subsequently becoming highly dependent upon imports of maize, predominantly subsidized maize from the United States, whereas the country was largely self-sufficient until the beginning of structural adjustment in the mid-1980s, producing 98% of its maize consumption. Since then, it's only producing about 77% of its maize consumption. And I should point out that per capita maize consumption has remained constant over time. But at the same time, maize's share of cultivated land has decreased by 38%. So you're seeing a transition of agricultural land away from maize into other crops, including those non-traditional agricultural exports, as well as, what I consider non-traditional agricultural exports, crops like oil palm, where Guatemala is now the world's fourth largest exporter of palm oil, and cardamom, the world's second largest exporter of cardamom, and so on. So what that meant then, and what I'm drawing upon here is data from the country's two most recent, believe it or not, agricultural censuses, one in 1979 and then the most recent in 2003. And what you're seeing here is the change in maize acreage, and much of the dark shade, those countries that are shaded dark, is where you've seen the greatest decrease in the cultivation of maize. And as I said, much of that, you've seen a dramatic increase in the cultivation of maize in the Petén, which was previously forested. And it's been increasingly promoted by the Guatemalan government as a land to be colonized by landless and land poor farmers who don't have access to the more productive land on the southern coast in Piedmont. But what you see here is, if we recall that much of that agricultural biodiversity, which was reflected by the size of the circles in this figure, is where in many respects you've seen some of the most dramatic decreases in maize land, not so much in Totonicapán, but Chimaltenango, which will be the center of much of my discussion later today. It was, a very important center of maize diversity, at least according to Wellhausen et al. In the 1950s, but you've seen a dramatic drop in maize acreage in the department, and as I'll point out, largely the adoption of those non-traditional agricultural export crops, but also a drop in maize land in other parts of the country as well, Huehuetenango, which is an important part of maize diversity, and so on. This is, I don't want to bore you too much with the details of this, but just again, this is comparing some of the data from the 4 agricultural censuses that have been administered in Guatemala over the country's history. But what you can see is a dramatic drop in the maize's share of agricultural land from the 1950s until today, and in particular in Chimaltenango, but also within Chimaltenango, a dramatic drop in the maize area overall. But at the same time, in terms of those farmers using those improved seed varieties, nationwide, roughly about a quarter of farmers use improved seed varieties. And in Chimaltenango, which I'll talk about in a moment here, about 1 in 5 farmers using those improved seed varieties. So what I'm trying to get at here is, through these restructuring of land use practices in Guatemala since the 1980s, you have seen likely a decrease in maize diversity and crop genetic diversity within the country over time. Again, it's difficult to document that. These are just simply indicators of that. And indeed, a transition away from maize towards other crops. Um, Now, as I said, part of that transition entails the shift to non-traditional agriculture exports. Um, and this is just some of the select non-traditional agriculture exports data from the area cultivated with non-traditional agricultural exports. And indeed, you'll see from the mid-1990s, and particular from the 2000 onwards, a dramatic increase in the amount of land cultivated with non-traditional agriculture exports. And in addition to that, Guatemala, or perhaps because of that rather, Guatemala supplier of many of the world's so-called winter fruits and vegetables, where this argument was that one needed to do, the International Monetary Fund's logic, the World Bank's logic in de-developing maize agriculture was that it was an inefficient use of resources in Guatemala, and that Guatemala should transition to a more efficient, or rather basically develop a new comparative advantage in what are called winter fruits and vegetables. Basically, now when we walk into our grocery stores in the months of November, December, January, February, that we can go in and we can buy green peas, papayas, green beans, cauliflower, pineapple, blackberries, and so on. A lot of this produce, of course, cultivated in southern countries. Chief among them, or oftentimes high among them, Guatemala, which is the world's second largest exporter of green peas, the world's second largest exporter of papayas, fourth largest exporter of green beans, ninth largest exporter of cauliflower and broccoli. I would argue it'd be much for just broccoli there. Pineapple. And I should also point out it's a major supplier of blackberries during certain months, during the off months in Mexico, as well as other crops. So Guatemala is emerging. Wow, we're running out of time here, so I'll rush through here. But it's emerging as a major supplier of these winter fruits and vegetables. Hello, yes. Hello.
I think somebody was answering their phone, Ryan. You can keep going.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wish I could see your pictures, but I can't because I'm sharing my screen. So thanks, Michael. Okay, so and much of this development of non-traditional agricultural exports in the Highlands was promoted by the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is, I don't want to go too much into this, but they created a parallel state in terms of developing a lot of NGOs that provided irrigation, infrastructure, export promotion, and so on. So and since the 1990s, you've seen the emergence of a real development industry in Guatemala that surrounds promoting these non-traditional agriculture exports. And for many farmers, this is indeed the best livelihood option available to them, where as the state rolled back support for Green Revolution maize and had lost much of the seed knowledge for traditional maize agriculture, there were few options for them to generate income. The Green Revolution agriculture oftentimes just contributed to debt, where there was shrinking markets for that maize output, but also rising input prices. And many of them did not want to go and work on the plantations on the coast and so on. And so as Fisher and Benson, through a brilliant book called Of Broccoli and Desire, talk about how many farmers saw this as the best livelihood option to them because it gave them a degree of autonomy. But what one sees is that over time, well, first of all, I should point out that several scholars have studied this non-traditional agriculture export in Guatemala, and they documented that initially during those 1990s, there were indeed initial improvements, that the initial adopters, those who initially had access to irrigation and seed and inputs and knowledge to cultivate those non-traditional crops, benefited from increased incomes, increased access to land, initially better diets, but that over time, often, as they de-developed that Milpa, as they lost that Milpa agriculture, they basically incurred higher food expenditures buying food but higher incidence of malnutrition because the food that they could afford was, not particularly rich in nutrients and certainly didn't have the nutrients of the beans, tomatoes, avocados, and other crops within that milpa. And over time, additionally, you've seen growing incidences of child stunting and malnutrition amongst those adopters of non-traditional agricultural exports. And as other scholars have pointed out, that much of the increase, because these are very labor-intensive crops, that you've seen an increased workload for women. So as I said, this is what other scholars have done. What I want to focus upon is some of my recent work in the Department of Chimaltenango, which is arguably the heartland for much of the cultivation of non-traditional agricultural exports. And indeed, what you see here is the Department of Guatemala, where Guatemala City is, and non-traditional agriculture exports were started to be promoted in the 1980s. They initially targeted those lands immediately outside of the city that, for crops that could be air cargoed to northern markets. And so in Chimaltenango, I just began research there last year in 2019. Some of my research assistants and I administered a survey, which was part of a larger project, but we surveyed 168 agricultural households in two municipalities of Chimaltenango. And I should point out that Chimaltenango is the source of, I think, if I remember correctly, about 2/3 of the broccoli exports and a significant portion of the green beans and pea exports, snow pea exports, amongst blackberry exports as well. So in Chimaltenango, these are some of the non-traditional crops that were in the prevalence of non-traditional crops grown by farmers in Chimaltenango that I surveyed. You'll note that many of the farmers who continued to grow these non-traditional crops also grew maize for household subsistence, but they also cultivated non-traditional crops on their irrigated plots of land. And indeed, what you'll see here is that some of these crops, the farmers who can cultivate these non-traditional crops oftentimes have to have access to an alternative source of water. Indeed, nearly all the blackberry growers that I surveyed, most of them had irrigation, some had some type of a spring or a river that they access water to on their land. Same with green beans. Less so with broccoli. Well, and you'll see broccoli is kind of an interesting story. Broccoli producers actually buy their water, and they'll basically buy water, and big trucks will come in and pipe that water onto the land. Other crops like snow peas and peas, in many respects they're taking the place of they're a type of legume, and they are a little bit less water dependent and can oftentimes be grown in conjunction with maize. And so what you see here, these are the farmers who cultivate maize without those non-traditional agricultural exports. So basically what I'm trying to get at here, some of these crops, blackberries, green beans, broccoli, very highly water dependent. The problem is many of those water sources are drying up. During the 1990s, as we said, the farmers who were initially able to access water were the initial adopters of this. But as cultivation has expanded and over time, much of those springs, rivers, and wells are drying up. And so there's a growing dependence upon purchased water. And much of that water that is purchased is oftentimes water coming from the land of the original agricultural elites, the large plantation owners, or finca owners as they were called in the Highlands, who still own large plots of forested lands and the best quality farmland, are now selling water to farmers. And this is just simply a small version of what they call a deposito, but there's also these big semi-trailers called pipas, which one can buy as well. And you'll see them driving up and down the roads throughout Chimaltenango. In addition to increased purchases of water, there's also growing dependence upon pesticides. So you're seeing what you're seeing here is indeed, well, Guatemala has imported pesticides. Pesticides have increased more significantly since the 1990s, or the rate of adoption of imports has increased significantly since the 1990s. And also what you see in this figure here is that within my survey, most farmers are highly dependent of those non-traditional agricultural exports, are highly dependent upon, in particular, fertilizers, insecticides, less selectively fungicides, insecticides and herbicides, particularly compared to maize. But you'll notice here that again, even maize farmers are or buy fertilizer. Now the question is whether or not they buy that fertilizer for their maize or for their crops, which I still need to disentangle from that survey. But at the same time, even as there's adopting these crops are oftentimes highly susceptible to environmental stresses, depending upon the crop. Blackberry, even though many of them are irrigated, you'll still see that farmers, 63% of the growers, more than roughly 2/3 have suffered major crop losses due to drought. They've suffered, 3/4 have suffered major drop losses due to pests, another 3/4 to plant disease. Green beans, highly susceptible to excessive rain, though I didn't capture this in the survey, hail and plant disease. Meanwhile, the maize is indeed, it's susceptible to drought, but less susceptible to those other environmental stresses, comparatively speaking. And similar would go for economic challenges, where many of the growers of these non-traditional crops have suffered a number of challenges economically, particularly compared to the maize growers, where they've had very few economic challenges. And ultimately then, so what you're seeing is a growing stress, where farmers are on the one hand facing growing. Here's the share, the percent of farmers taking out loans to support their agricultural production, and this is on a scale of 1 to 5, where nearly all green bean producers maintain that they allocated nearly all their loans to the green bean production, and most of the green peas, snow peas, and blackberry producers allocated most of their loans to agricultural production. While for maize growers, it was less than half who dedicated half of their loans to agricultural production. And of course, complementing this, and as you're seeing growing crop failures and growing dependence upon water and increased competition, is dropping prices for the output and rising levels of debt. And indeed, this debt is a major source of stress for these agricultural producers, where if we combine, on the one hand, those changes in the environment with changes in the finance, where much of the development initiatives within Guatemala in recent years have been targeted at financial inclusion and this proliferation of financial service industry throughout much of rural Guatemala, easy credit, that these farmers are increasingly rolling over debt, taking out one loan from one microfinance institute to pay off another, and so on. And this debt is an increasing source of stress. And in response to this stress, what are they doing? They're intensifying their agricultural production and ultimately putting more strain on water resources and so on. And with these interviews that I did back in January, many of the farmers that I interviewed talked about how where water has been becoming less and less available over time. And now they only get it on very few days. And of course, with decreasing rainfall in the region due to climate change, what you're seeing then is this exacerbation of indeed not only sort of the stress of the environment on those crops, but also the financial stress as well. So what I'm trying to get at here is, when we're talking about when I'm thinking of resilience here, on the one hand, we need to be thinking of the ways in which environmental change is tied to resilience, but also the ways in which agricultural producers are tied to the financial system. Clock, and I should probably call it good for my presentation now. So I hope this was clear. I hope it was coherent. I've got a slide a bit later in which I thank some of my research assistants. I'll name them here: Alejandro Posada, Juan Velez, Yolanda Menchu, Astrid Galvez, as well as within Guatemala. Those were all University of Toronto students. Within Guatemala, Ana Lucia Quil, Wendy Patal, and Wilda Robles. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn off my share screen now, and we can open this up. Okay, let's see.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. I really enjoyed that talk. So we do have a bit of time. I think, are we okay to go a little bit over? If you have to drop off, of course, please do so. But we have a little bit of time for questions if folks have any questions for Ryan. You can just speak up or write your question in the chat. So I'll maybe kick us off then, Ryan. I really found your talk quite interesting, and my interest is, of course, connected to sort of the demand for the different types of produce that is being, my cat is being a little pushy.
I had that when I was preparing my slides earlier today.
I was interested in the types of foods that are sort of in demand that are being grown in Guatemala. So I imagine a lot of the demand for raspberries and things like that you mentioned are from northern markets. And I was wondering if that at the end of the day that ultimately there isn't really a sort of a resilient solution to this given the shortages of water. I mean, do you see a sort of a win-win situation where there can be the production of certain types of crops that can be exported in a way that isn't sort of predatory on the farmers? So for example, this debt issue that you started to tackle at the end of the talk, in addition to sort of the stressors on the environment. Does that make sense? Like, do you see a way in which that can happen sustainably and resilient?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, Michael, in a way in which that could happen sustainably. I mean, one thing I will point out is, back when I did my PhD research back in, early 2000s, it was in a different part of Guatemala, in Totonicapán. But in that particular part of the country, on the one hand, there was a high prevalence of that to more sort of traditional Milpa agriculture in the country. And yet it was on the fringes of as the push for non-traditional agricultural exports started to go deeper and deeper into the highlands. Farmers would adopt the non-traditional exports, but they would do so on a fairly in a fairly cautious manner, where they always made sure they had sufficient land to meet their household needs, or at least meet the majority of their household needs, and only dedicate a small fraction to the cultivation of these non-traditional exports. And in part, that was dependent upon access to irrigation, but also, what Michael Lipton and other scholars referred to the safety first decision rule. You want to make, these are very marginalized actors, very poor farmers, and they want to make sure subsistence needs are met first. But what I'm trying to get at there is, that traditional milpa is indeed, it's a fairly sustainable system. And it's, the farmers who, certainly if they're saving their own seeds and they're intercropping it relieves a lot of dependence, purchase seeds, fertilizers, and so on, right? It's basically agroecological. And so those farmers who have stuck with that have not incurred significantly high levels of debt. So in some sense, we could look at maybe perhaps paring back. What I'm trying to get at here is perhaps paring back on some of those, the cultivation of non-traditional exports. I think that there's a role for those, and many farmers, they have benefited from them, and they have the potential to generate high returns. But also, there's also high risks associated with those, as well as high debt that I pointed out right now. So in some sense, what I'm, if one could transition some of that land back to more sort of an agroecological milpa, that would, I think, be very helpful in terms of breaking that, on the one hand, improving the resilience to climatic stress or environmental stresses, but also decreasing dependence upon financial credit. But the challenge, of course, is, many farmers I'd mentioned to, many farmers I spoke with in January talked about this, is once you've cultivated land with those non-traditional agricultural exports, particularly crops like blackberries and broccoli that are very chemical intensive, that they can't revert that land back to milpa simply because the soil is so degraded. And so oftentimes all they'll do is just switch from one crop to another. So the point that I'm trying to get is this transition to agroecological basically takes some time to rehabilitate that soil and its ability to support those more subsistence-based crops.
Yeah, interesting. There's another question from the chat here.
Okay.
They ask, is there any form of irrigation farming at all as an alternative source for the water scarcity? So I think asking about, well, what could we do about water scarcity?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, it's, as I said, when I was there, farmers talked about the river levels getting lower, the aquifers getting lower, their wells getting lower. And I'm not personally aware of any. I can remember years, just, I happened to be in a hotel and talking to a Dutch, was some sort of NGO worker, but he was talking about doing cloud harvesting in the Highlands as a water source. And I honestly, I don't know how well that works, and if it works, or if that sort of competes with other water sources. But certainly in the highlands during our summer months, it can be quite cloudy, and so potentially that could be a way of sort of capturing moisture. But I'm not certain of that.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Let's maybe do one more question. We're running a bit over, so before we wrap up, if anyone else has any final thoughts or questions they'd like to. Tracy.
Yeah, thank you for this, Ryan. Really, really fascinating work that you and other scholars do in this area, and I can see a lot of little threads that link us together, even across very different contexts. But I just wondered, in the Guatemalan context, to what extent has privatization of land, and possibly including relocation of indigenous peoples, away from privatized land, complicated the possibility of return to a Milpa system?
That's a great question. Indeed, as we've seen in many parts of the world since the 1990s, there's been, in Guatemala, as part of the peace accords, there was a big push towards land titling within the country. There was the promotion of what was called market-assisted land reform as a way of resolving the highly unequal distribution of land within the country. But oftentimes through that titling process, what that meant is that it's contributed to, on the one hand, many distress cells where farmers in debt or facing a health crisis or even wanting to finance migration in the present day have, either sold that land or taken used that land as collateral and lost it. And so in some sense, that what was intended to, the land titling initiative, which was intended to basically farmers to use that land as collateral and invest in it, and contribute to a more equitable distribution of land, has in fact contributed to the concentration of land holdings in certain pockets. Now within the highlands where I work, I mean, that's in part, there's a lot of dynamics at play here, where on the one hand, you got the growing prevalence of access to credit, as well as remittances coming in, and the way in which those US dollars coming in, even Canadian dollars coming in, have allowed better off farmers to accumulate land at the expense of poorer farmers. But what's interesting in those contexts, oftentimes, not always, of course, it's, leads to this, again, unequal distribution. But on the one hand, a lot of that land is used to create these, mega blocks made out of cinder blocks and so on, right? But oftentimes it does actually, because they have those higher land holdings, what my sort of my casual observation here is that in fact they've been able to revert some of that land back to cultivating some of the traditional land races and so on. But of course, you're seeing the other farmers losing their land and moving to places where it's even more inhospitable and so on. I should also point out that through the land reform process, much of the land that's been made available to these landless and land poor farmers is in environments very distinct from where they are, where much of the indigenous farmers are concentrated in the highlands, and they're getting sort of this marginal land on the coast in the Petén and so on, and where their traditional seed varieties aren't as productive. And so there's a dependence upon hybrid seeds in those particular environments, simply because they don't have access to the land races for those environmental niches.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to do one final question, but before we do that, I just want to make a quick note for those who are still on the call that on November 2nd, we'll be having a speaker from outside of U of T for the first time, I believe. Aaron Beal would be joining us from Johns Hopkins University to talk about foods. I couldn't find the title. Food System Resilience Planning in 5 U.S. cities. So if you are available at the same time next week at 4 p.m., we look forward to seeing you then. But for our final question, I'll turn it over to Chris. Go ahead.
So thanks for the talk. I think it was really interesting to kind of show the other end of things from what Michael was talking about last week. You mentioned the sort of the interaction between agricultural science and the politics with the pushing of the green technology. And you also made a comment about how in the area that you're working in, it was next door to Guatemala City. And of course, they had access to the air shipment and air freight. And so I'm wondering if there's also that technological political interaction between, you know, things like information technology or transportation technology. So things that are about the kind of the physical supply chain and the informational supply chain that also had similar impact or related impact as you painted the picture of with the green technology.
Sure. Okay, so I'm sorry, there was the information technology, and what was the second component?
The transportation.
Transportation.
Yeah.
Okay. Gosh, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, one thing I thought was quite interesting, as I said, I've been doing research in Guatemala. Well, I started traveling to Guatemala in the late 1990s. What I found is be interesting over time is, particularly in Chimaltenango, simply the development of roads. And certainly within Chimaltenango, where the roads, you know, used to be awful. Even just the Inter-American highway going through the department was, you know, potholes and quite rough, but certainly the roads off of it. But even into the more remote areas, you've certainly seen improved transport facilities, certain improved roads. The Inter-American highway is much better, but also the roads just going into the villages. And, you know, I think it would be an interesting study to look at how that's associated with the development of traditional agricultural exports, but there's certainly a positive correlation there. I can say that fairly confidently.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of sort of the, you know, the venture capital model where you create some sort of ability to do something, and then you know, coerce everyone into using that ability to do something, given that you're gonna make a cut of them using the functionality that you've created.
Yeah. I mean, I think the buyers have certainly used a lot of that coercion over time. I mean, in the survey as well as interviews, farmers talked about how they used to grow other non-traditional crops, and then the buyer said, "Oh, this market's saturated. Everybody switch over to this crop." You know, from going the green beans to the blackberry, for instance, or from broccoli to green beans, even more historically. But you know, there were sort of booms and busts, and you know, non-traditional crops like cucumbers and strawberries, even.
Interesting. Thank you. I think that was really, really good.
Yeah, thanks again, Ryan, and thanks for everyone who attended the talk. And so I look forward to seeing you all in future talks. And if you are curious about what's coming up, please just visit the Resilience in Food and Health Systems Supply Chains website on the School of Cities page. So we'll see you next time. Okay. All right.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
Everyone. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.